Welcome, everybody. And this is our second lecture. What I'm going to do today is talk about culture and international marketing. Um, I'm going to kind of skip a few things in here because we'll do them during the live class. But what I'm mainly going to do is focus on getting you to rethink a number of areas of culture as the way in which it might have been taught in other parts of the program. And also at the end, I'm going to do a little bit of an add on, which is a bit technical, but may help those of you that will be doing your dissertations and might be using surveys or doing things which are culture related. Now, when we talk about culture, there are lots of very different definitions. Some of these are related to psychology, some of these are related to sociology, some are related to anthropology. It really does vary quite a lot. And at times you can get really confused in terms of what it is that's being discussed with respect to culture. So, for example, if we think about it more generally, it's very much an umbrella term. It might show up in things like etiquette. In other words, how do you greet an individual? Do you, for example, kiss them on one cheek? Do you kiss them on two cheeks? Do you shake their hand? Do you bow to them, and so on the line? It could be related to customs, in other words, routines associated with things like sleeping, bathing, or not bathing, how it is that you eat, and on and on and on and on and on. In a more psychological way, it can be related to ways of thinking, in other words, cognitive schema. In other words, how do individuals organize things mentally? While this might sound strange, there actually are very substantive differences between language structures and the way in which people organize things in their mind. So, for example, the structure of English language sentences, are, as opposed to the structure of Germanic, other Germanic language sentences, the structure, for example, the differences in structure between pictographic languages such as Chinese or Japanese, and then even in the differences between Japanese and Chinese and the nature of the sentence structures. All of this has big effects on cognitive schema. And then ways of doing things. In other words, value structures. How do you prioritize? I'll talk a little bit about this later on because I've done some work on this. So there are things that people talk about when they talk about culture. They talk about shared systems of meanings. This is a very sociological type of approach. The fact that culture is learned and imprinted, it's a collective phenomenon of imprinting, which you sometimes see in anthropological work. And there are also different layers of this, and this is where I think a lot of the confusion comes in. And that is that in the international business field, a lot of the discussion is related primarily to national culture, but the nature of culture is far more expansive. And I'll talk about this later on, but there are different professional cultures, there are different corporate cultures, there are local tribes. It has significant ways of doing things. So while I might be teaching this class in English, that doesn't necessarily mean that the way in which it's being interpreted by individuals who do not have English as the primary language would be quite different. When we look at the origins of culture, and this is, I think, where the IB field probably is behind the curve to a great deal, but also many areas of management as well are behind it because this is something which typically is discussed in more in anthropology and sometimes in kind of the ecological history as well, where there are kind of underlying origins. For example, ways of eating being related to the nature of what it is that was available to individuals. This has been something which, if you look at books like Guns, Germs, and Steel, um, this sort of kind of view that says, well, okay, look, there are economic, geographic, ecological, environmental reasons why cultures form in the way in which they did, or why it is, for example, that in Mesoamerica there was no real metalwork. Why was that the case when metalworking was discovered centuries and centuries and centuries before, in both Asia and Europe and parts of Africa? So there's this issue of history, technology, kind of the political economy associated with things. Um, and all of this can kind of work its way up through things which ultimately then pop out as consumption behaviors or management styles in the case of business. And if you will notice here, of course, that there's a lot of stuff in between. There are a lot of social institutions in between. But one of the things that this hides, it kind of has a, okay, we begin at the top and we kind of work our way through. But there is what we in the academic realm would call endogeneity. In other words, there are feedback loops here, that history and social institutions, in and of themselves, while they look like history might precede social institutions, the two of them are actually quite tightly bound. The history of yesterday affects the history of today. The institutions of today affect the history of tomorrow. And the same is true with technology and political development as well. So these things are not so kind of linear in their flow, nor is it clear what the causal components of this really are. So you can also look at it in aspects of with respect to things like peers, and as peers do not randomly appear. Peers uh, are selected in some sense. Individuals typically don't seek out others who have radically opposing views to one another. So what happens, of course, is that you get a reinforcement mechanism. We've seen this a lot in social media recently, but it is a historic phenomenon. And then ultimately, these things kind of can flow down onto the nature of the management styles. But again, there's a feedback loop which goes back to this, and that is our social institutions, the former of behaviors, are they formed by behaviors? And the answer to that question, of course, is that there's both to those. The question, of course, is how strong that is in specific types of areas. So it's not so easy to kind of go back and sort of say, well, all right, this is how it is. And what this means is it means it's actually quite difficult in some sense to engineer a culture. In that if you started from scratch and you had a blank slate and you wanted to engineer a culture, how what is it you would do this? And if you look in the again going back to the literature, at least from a measurement standpoint, people typically try to measure culture in a number of different ways. And you'll see, again, depending on the areas in which you look, and I'll talk about a few of these, um, there are different measures of culture out there which include different things. Some include religion, some don't. Some include political philosophy. Some include the education background, language, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There are all sorts of things, and this is only kind of a really limited number of the things that would apply to what it is that affects that kind of norms and value systems that might be considered to be embodying culture. Although I would argue that it goes beyond norms and value systems. Um, so when we look at what it is that individuals are doing, how is it that they would operate? So, for example, the norms and values of one religious group may be very different from another religious group, but it may be that the commonalities dominate, so that you have a tendency at times to really have to be concerned about the degree to which what you're doing is you're really seeking out similarities, you're seeking out differences when you're talking about culture. But I'll come back to that again. So normally we can kind of break this down into, at least from a measurement standpoint, when we start talking about it. as having kind of various elements. So you can think about there being an underlying value structure around the culture. And the value structure allows you to, in some sense, engage in trade offs. When you talk about values, you don't want to talk about them in the abstract in some sense. You're talking about them relative to one another. Um, so yes, indeed, all individuals care about money. Right. The question, of course, is on a scale from 100 to zero, people can be very different. That doesn't really matter in many respects. When we ask the question, well, do they care about their children's schooling as opposed to care about their income? Which of these would they trade off? So in some sense, the importance of the values can be expressed in an absolute sense, which creates real problems for you, because typically people tend to value pretty much everything. The question then becomes, all right, well, relatively speaking, how do they do this? How, if push came to shove, would you sacrifice your children for income, or your income for children, or your or income for health, or your health for your children's health, or your health for your neighbor's health, and on down the line? These are actually quite the important parts of the value structures. And a lot of these, of course, come from upbringing, but they're affected in other ways. So if you look at the recent QAnon phenomenon, particularly in the United States, but it's actually filtered over into places like the United Kingdom and elsewhere. What you see there, in some sense, is, well, were these individuals brought up to be conspiracy theorists? Do blame their parents, or was this a value structure which in some sense emerged or was developed later in their lives? No one knows the answer to that question, but the question itself is actually quite critical, because if the values are really deeply embedded, then they don't change. Okay, so if you believe that these values are deeply embedded, then conspiracy theorists' tendencies should be found when they were children. They should be much more difficult, for example, to unroot. If you talk about, let's say, extremism, in terms of the nature of various other cults, the answer is, well, de-radicalization simply won't work if the value structures are very tight. There's then rituals, which is kind of visualization. In other words, how do these things manifest themselves? I gave the example there of the New Zealand rugby team. Um, the, the main point here being that these rituals are meant to express something, and uh, the longevity of that ritual, the generalizability of that ritual, is actually quite keen. Religions, for example, are just loaded with rituals, and the and you can see this by going from one country to another country and look at the same religion in different countries, and you'll see the similarity across the rituals. Um, but there are all sorts of other rituals that we go through, some of which we may not even know we go through. So rituals can pop up in all sorts of ways. Um, there's also symbols. In other words, how do we perceive things? I've given some examples here simply of country perceptions. So these are the logos that are used by various countries. And again, this is only one aspect of symbolism, but I'll give you more as we go along. And then there are beliefs. In this case here, it's related to halal food. But again, you have other things about what it is that you consider to be true. Okay, and now this is different from values, because people tend to lump values and beliefs here. And in other words, the values are things for which you put utility. Beliefs are things for which you consider them to be true or right. So there is a difference between beliefs and values. There tends to be a confusion amongst these things. But beliefs, in some sense, are an assumption about how things operate. Values are really related to what it is the individuals are afraid of. And then there are the cognitive schemas and the thought processes. How is it that individuals arrange what it is that they do, how it is that they work? So we'll come back again to this, but the education process you're going through is affecting your thought processes. By definition, that might be moving you into a cultural group for which you might not necessarily think of it as a cultural group, but in reality it is. And then you can think from a marketing standpoint, which is really kind of where a lot of this would go, that this impacts all sorts of things. It impacts design, it impacts distribution, it impacts promotion, it impacts what it is people think that is that they're consuming. So all of that matters in some sense. A number of years ago, I did a research project which looked at the ethnography associated with kind of social consumption, what we call ethical consumption, but I don't like that term. And what you see in that is you see fundamentally there's almost no differences among people across countries, which is kind of surprising. People would think, oh well, the Germans and the Spanish and the Americans and the Australians and the Chinese and the Indians and the Turks and the Swedes and so on down the line, that they're different. And the answer to that question is that they're actually not. It's surprisingly similar in terms of their preference structures. In other words, their values. What is more interesting is how it is that they structure those values. In other words, what it is that they do to kind of express themselves. Those are very different. So in some sense, what we discovered in some of our work was that fundamentally most individuals are not that environmentally conscious. Yeah, they care to some degree, but in terms of priorities, it isn't necessarily that high. But they believe that they are good at these things. When you show, in fact, that they're not good at these things, you actually see that their rationalizations are very different. Um, what this means, of course, is it means that potentially how it is that you would communicate with those individuals is actually quite different. So it isn't the values that are that different. It's the kind of the way in which individuals rationalize or think about the nature of those values. That has very big implications for marketing because that marketing has a huge communication component, a huge persuasive component, and that persuasive component is going to be related a lot to that. And therefore, it means that if the ideas here are to kind of change individuals' value structures, change their trade offs, then how do you do this? You do this through rituals, you do it through symbols, do it through beliefs, which might be harder, or do you do it through thought processes, which might be harder, which means that you might accommodate thought processes, but utilize symbols and rituals. So there's actually a complicated mix here. Now, there are different viewpoints of these of culture, and you will have seen these in your prior classes, so I'm not going to go into these in any detail. I would put two of these kind of at an extreme, and we'll come back and ask the question which of these is better, which of these is worse. But Hofstede's measures were developed primarily within one company and looking at human resources. Okay, ultimately, Hofstede was used as a national culture measure, but fundamentally, it's really a within company corporate measure that isn't really at the individual level. So it's kind of hard to interpret exactly what it is that it is. And it's used quite a lot. The real question is the validity of it. Schwartz is a bit more fundamental. Schwartz really was focused on kind of fundamental value structures. And in his case, they're kind of categorized in four major categories, as is shown there. And then within this, there's kind of a sub measure or more than one sub measure actually that effectively kind of tells you something about those overarching constructs within that. And again, ultimately the point of these two is to kind of distinguish between one group of individuals and another group of individuals. The Schwartz measures, of course, are much more attuned to the individual, which means that you can talk about Schwartz at an individual level, But you really can't talk about Hofstede at an individual level, even though people do. The main point of it is that it's meant to Schwartz is meant to tell you something about yourself. Hofstede really doesn't tell you anything about yourself. It's meant to tell you about the structure around you, which is why, in some sense, its only real value is at the national level. If it does have value, I tend to be a believer that it should be kind of put to the side, but we'll come back to that. And you can also see when you look at Hofstede, for example, one of the reasons why there might be differences here. And one way to think about this is what Hofstede does is Hofstede breaks things down into five ones, five different ways of thinking about things. There are only four of them shown here, but this is but suppose what happens is rather than talking about power distance, we just simply talked about the countries. Now, the difficulty that creates, of course, is that when we talk about power distance, we have one measure. When we talk about the countries, if we use, let's say, dummy variables, 0, 1 if you're in the United States, 0, 1 if you're in Canada, and so on and on, would we see something which is more valuable to us? And the answer to that question is yes, we would, because remember, the whole point of Hofstede is to measure the differences between, say, Russians and Americans. The problem is that Hofstede creates a scale, and that scale, in theory, at least has an infinite number of points on it. But if we use dummy variables, we are able to identify the specific differences. So Hofstede has embedded in it a view of the similarity between countries, and therefore Kazakhstan and Russia are similar, and Canada and America are similar on the vast majority of the measures, and therefore we when we looked at this, we would be doing is we would be more or less kind of weighting Russia and weighting Kazakhstan in very much a similar way. That puts a constraint there in the sense that you have to believe that power distance matters. You have to believe that uncertainty avoidance matters. You have to believe that the collectivism, individualism matters. It exists as an idea and a construct which materially matters. When in fact, it may be that it's not as good a differentiator as you would ultimately like, and that if you could do it at an individual country level, in other words, looked at each country individually, it would actually be better for you. The problem, of course, is that if you have 260 odd countries and you use 260 measures, that actually is analytically much harder. So what Hofstede tries to do is he tries to simplify it. And then the question, of course, is what's the value in that simplification? In the case of Schwartz, you actually have multiple measures from each individual. So the difference in the case of Hofstede, what you do is you have an aggregate measure across many different people. In the case of Schwartz, what you have is you actually have many different measures about one person, which means that you can take the underlying measures and these little points here. So these things like broad-minded would be a question in Schwartz's measurement instrument. And therefore you can look at this and sort of say, well, what I'm going to have is I'm going to have 90 or 100 different ways of differentiating not only this individual from that individual, but groups of individuals. Okay, in other words, you can look at this with much greater nuance. The difference, of course, is in the case of Schwartz, this takes more time, which means that an individual who's answering a Schwartz questionnaire is going to have to spend a lot more time than an individual answering a Hofstede questionnaire. And then the value, of course, is that in the case of the Schwartz questionnaire, we can compare you to your neighbor. In the Hofstede one, we really can't compare you to your neighbor. And we'll come back to which of these is better. So we can talk about each of the underlying other components of this, and that is, for example, the rituals. the patterns of behavior and interaction that are learned and repeated. Now, a lot of this is associated with life events, so marriage, funerals, graduations, on down the line. For example, my family immigrated from Ireland, and in Ireland, wakes were very much the way you held funerals. And I still remember, even as a child, where the body would literally be in the living room of the house, and there would be a wake that would be held, at the house. Rarely do you ever see that these days, and that's in some sense a ritual which is kind of going away. Marriages as well. The question, of course, is why do people spend so much money on marriages, or weddings, as it may be? The whole graduation ritual associated with graduating. Um, in my case, for example, I'll keep using myself as an example here. I went to my college graduation, because I had to give a speech, so I had to be there because it was days before Zoom. And but I never attended any other graduations. So when I received my MBA, my master's degree, my PhD, I never attended the graduations. The rituals didn't mean very much to me, but for many people, those rituals are very, very, very important. So there are lots of those which are like that. But then there were small rituals, and then in fact, in the COVID lockdown, one of the things that's very interesting is the interaction with COVID with small rituals, going to the restaurants with friends, daily grooming. Are you wearing pants? Kind of below this level. The visiting stores, going out shopping with friends, so on down the line. The rituals may change. So the rituals may change from dinner at restaurants to walking the dog. The trade off of those rituals may change. The question, of course, is in the long run, how solid are they? But there are small rituals associated with things, and then the coordination of activities. They allow people to understand what to expect. It's kind of humorous when you look at, for example, what's the gift giving ritual associated with weddings. In terms of what people do, in terms of in terms of things, in terms of the amount of money that they give. Do they give money, or do they give things in very large packages, and on down the line? My wife used to run all the major external events for a very large set of department stores in Australia, and she also ran all the bridal registries. So I don't know how many of them there were, probably 150 or 200 of these things. And you get to see, very close proximity, the nature of wedding rituals in terms of what it is people buy. In the case of symbols, of course, this is related to communication. So I can put a symbol up, and that symbol would have material meaning to people. It simplifies things. Kind of this notion of picture is worth 1,000 words. It simplifies things so that the symbol itself actually has meaning. I'll come back later on, talk about stuff like this, but the color and the structure of the symbol itself. Um, Language is also a symbol, in some ways. It actually has, kind of meaning. If you think about individuals who have multiple cultures, that you can see a lot of this showing up in terms of this. So you take individuals, for example, I hold several citizenships and several residences. Um, that implies the necessity of being able to communicate in different cultures, in different languages. Um, how to interpret these things in different contexts. All of that actually, um, is embedded in the language and the nature of the structure of the language. Which is why at times, the idiomatic aspects of language can bemuse foreigners, and it's because they don't understand the nature of the symbolism of the language. And then there's also the aesthetics associated with it, which come in music, drama, dance, dress, and on and on. All of this kind of has an aspect of importance to it. It, and people kind of bring these out sometimes in very odd ways, but you do see them. You see, for example, Burns Night related to Scotland, where men dress in kilts, and you have the midsummer festivals in places like Sweden. You have Oktoberfest, and you can work your way through any region or any area and find exactly the same types of things, and they all matter. But there's an enormous amount of symbolism attached to them. The dress, the nature of the dance, and so on and on. And there's beliefs, and this is kind of related to a lot of things. Now, the first thing I sort of say is it stems mainly from religious training, um, and to a greater extent, this is true. Um, while we tend to think at times that science is where kind of beliefs about what is true and what is not true come from, that's actually rare. Um, so it's in some sense, if you look at all the discussions again around COVID about following the science, very few people follow the science. In fact, very few people know the science. What they do is they have beliefs which fundamentally are driven by other factors, and religion is one of the very dominant ones. Now, we can look from the period of the Industrial Revolution forward into some sense, um, the Enlightenment forward, um, that says, well, religion became less important in terms of the nature of driving these beliefs. But that's fundamentally a narrow view of how this works. So there are aspects of this. So you can see this in very strange ways. Okay, so for example, Western aversion to the number 13, the Chinese practice of feng shui, the fact that different numbers in different cultures mean uh, differentially different things. Um, all of this actually has it. And in some sense, what beliefs are about is beliefs are about kind of causal paths. Uh, why does something occur? Why does it occur in some order? All of these types of things, kind of come up. And interestingly, a lot of it is driven by religion, um, or at least kind of a historic kind of component of this, which goes back, for many periods of time. And then there's finally thought process. So ways of thinking across cultures. And there are studies which show this. For example, the nature of sensory perceptions, what people perceive in terms of smells, what people perceive in terms of time frames. There's some very interesting studies. In fact, one was done by I think HSBC or Barclays, where they looked at how different parts of their operations across the world perceive the passage of time, um, which was related to the kind of perceptions of punctuality, which was more or less related to the fact that they had lots of global virtual teams. Time didn't mean the same thing to different people, which led to all sorts of kind of interesting problems. So the notion of urgency wasn't really as as important in certain places as it was in other areas. Um, Also the nature of how individuals rely on um, intuition versus analysis. There's also some studies which show quite significant differences across individuals, and that is also related to aspects of kind of where they're from, the nation from which they come. And a lot of that is driven simply by the schooling that they've had. So while it might show up as kind of a national culture difference, fundamentally the difference is in the nature of you know of the schooling. And as somebody who's taught many students in many different countries over many years, you do see this. You do see it, kind of a more deliberative way of thinking amongst certain types of students from certain areas, simply because of the nature of the way in which they've been trained from being children. So it's not as if you can radically remove this, let's say, from a master student or an MBA student who's say 20 to 30 or 30 to 40. Um, it's extremely difficult to do that, because these processes have worked for those individuals over long periods of time, and also those thought processes are very consistent with the people around them. So you hear of notions of groupthink and stuff like that, but a lot of this is actually quite natural. In other words, if you put five Germans in the room, are you going to find that those five Germans engage in certain types of things in certain sorts of ways? The answer is yes. And I'll tell a kind of funny story about this, which is related a bit also to rituals. But when we were first living in Germany, my wife would comment on how the people who cleaned our house, um, were similar. It didn't matter who was there, who what cleaners we had, and we went from one house to another house and said, well, no, this is how they clean in Germany, and the question was why. And it's kind of humorous, but it turned out that in the 1950s and in 1960s, women were taught in house care. They literally were taught in school how to clean, what products to use, and on down the line. And some of my contemporaries and younger Germans, of course, would not have gone through this, and they would all laugh about how their mothers or their aunts and others were basically indoctrinated into this ritual of house cleaning and house care and family care and all this other stuff like that, and it was taught in the schools, uh, and it was almost militaristic in certain sorts of ways. Now today you would sort of see that disappear quite dramatically, but but it was actually part of the schooling structure, in terms of how it was that individuals learned to do the things that they learned to do. And you can see this in this example here. The If I go back, to the prior graph, the Japanese concern about the year of the fire horse, okay, which was viewed as an inauspicious period of time in which you have children. And if you look at this is the trend, right, over time of births. Yeah, people die at a regular way, right? So the astrological year has no impact on whether people die or not, but it has an enormous impact on where people were born. If you look at this, the rate drops by about 20% in this one year. And this was the year of the fire horse. Okay. So this belief was so strong in Japanese society, that women chose not to have children to a great extent. Now you might sort of say, okay, well, what about all the people who did? Well, maybe it was accidents, right? They do happen, or maybe it was just simply people who for whom that belief was not strong. But the belief apparently was sufficiently strong amongst some percent of the population to be a noticeable aberration in the trend rate. And you actually see this if you look, for example, at Indian marriages. When do they occur? If you look, also, it had historically been true in the case of Chinese astrological events such as births and marriages. Names seem to be correlated with astrological signs, in a number of countries. All of these things are kind of there, and you might sort of say, okay, well, how important are they? How important aren't they? They may be very explicit, or they may be actually quite latent. In other words, it might not be that all of these individuals are true believers, but they've got a little inkling in their mind. and that drives kind of a difference that they see. And you also have kind of aspects of related to sort of kind of where there is tolerance or intolerance. I'll talk a little bit later on when we get to some stuff which is related to measurement and thinking about culture. But one of the other questions that arises with respect to culture is, well, look, how tight is it? How much rigidity is there, let's say, within a cultural group? And does it allow, for example, new entrants into the culture? Does it allow people to leave the culture? Now, it sounds very much like a cult, but remember, the first four words of culture are cult. So the main point of this being that some cultures are very closed, some cultures are very open. So I'm an American, obviously. One of the views being that anybody can be an American. Australians, great degrees, is also a very open culture. Um, and even though there's kind of cultural stereotypes around Australians, I live in Sydney. I have a house in Sydney. I live in a district in which 60 some percent of the people who live in that district weren't born in the country. And on my street, which probably has about 25 houses, at one point in time, we did not have a single person own a house who was born in Australia, nor did we have a single family that had the same cultural background. So there were Koreans, Croatians, Slovenians, um, Dutch, Americans, Syrians, Lebanese, you name it. They were from all over the place, um, which would be very different um, from, for example, where we live in Berlin, where it is culturally fairly homogeneous. Even though it's Berlin, it's fairly homogeneous, but it is much less homogeneous than when I lived in a town called Trier, which was in the west of Germany, closer to the border of France, where it was dominantly German, but also not only dominantly German, but dominantly Rhineland. So you have differences associated with that. So it's a starting point for foreign companies in some sense. In other words, the 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 key in this regard is how do you know you're working well within that culture? Okay, how to appreciate what the components of that culture are, and try to use that in a way that makes it easier to be able to take your products and embed them in there. Now, you could have a view, which we'll talk about Ted Levitt and others at some point, that sort of says, okay, well, the global brands will dominate. They have their own identity. They will come in and they will exist as they exist everywhere. That's one view, right? I mean, and that is that part is simply that you don't have to worry about that culture to a greater or lesser degree. The other one is that it's fundamentally the kind of aspects of an adaptation. So how you communicate, how you advertise, what's the symbolism, what are the colors, all of this kind of comes into this. Okay, and it has a kind of a materiality, and you do see cultural conflicts which arise. When many U.S. fast food firms went into India, there were uproars by individuals who viewed it as a cultural attack. Um, when McDonald's first went into Germany, the view, of course, was that McDonald's really didn't belong in Germany. This was not kind of what Germans did, particularly at that time, which was the 1960s and 70s. And the reality was that older Germans, did not actually go to McDonald's. Who went to McDonald's were young people, and it turned out that there was something about the Americanism of McDonald's, which was one aspect of it, but the other aspect of it was that it gave these children freedom, which means that they could go to a restaurant at any time of the day and just hang out, which in German restaurants, hanging out is not what you do. And ultimately, of course, that caused a sea change. So even in the 1980s, you had very few of these chain restaurants. You had very few restaurants that, for example, that were open in, they would open from 11 to potentially 2. They would then close and open maybe at 5 or 6, and that was it. Um, all of that did change over time. Okay, but in some sense, McDonald's wasn't trying to get into Germany to be a group that was going to satisfy 60-year-old Germans in the 1960s or 70s, or even 50-year-old Germans. Okay, it actually resonated with 15-year-olds, 20-year-olds, and obviously those 20-year-olds then became 65-year-olds. But that's the main point. Um, and what this means is it means that there are nuances around all of this, and there are reasons why cultures exist, and they're not wrong. There's always a tendency at times to look at these things and question the correctness of a culture. They're different, and they do change. The question, of course, is how do they change and what the instigators of those changes are. And this is the aspect which is the kind of the dynamics of it. Culture is sticky, and one of the reasons that culture is sticky is because culture is made up of so many things. It's like a lot of bits and pieces that are glued together in an intricate pattern. And yeah, you might be able to chip one little bit of it off, but it doesn't change the pattern. It might not change the integrity of whatever it is that you've got there. In other words, you can take a look at, for example, a mosaic, and you can have bits of the mosaic fall out, and you can still see the pattern in the mosaic. And that's how culture operates. That's also what gives it its rigidity. Is also lots of financial and personal reasons not to change, which generates that conservatism. Um, but there are dynamics which do it, and there are also what are known in economics realm as punctuated equilibria, where means that things kind of look like they're stable, 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 then bang, they change. And in that set of circumstances, what do you have? You have a set of circumstances where you shift dramatically from one equilibrium to another equilibrium. Um, and a lot of that may kind of rip apart the underlying culture that is there, or that culture may, in some sense, find its way back. So it may shift dramatically and then erode back. So if you look at a lot of revolutions, let's say what happened in the early 1990s in places like the Soviet Union, you had a dramatic shift, which changed a lot of underlying cultural norms in the country. All the communist stuff disappeared. All of the schooling system changed. Getting rich was very different. But what you had, if you had a circle, the resilience associated with the established structures, bring Putin about and bring the situation you have yourself in. You see very similar sort of thing in China going on, where under Deng Xiaoping, you have to get rich is glorious type of model, where it doesn't matter whether the cat's black or white. You get an opening. That opening goes through Jiang Zemin and a number of others. Um, but you kind of have a neo Mao kind of counterculture that's coming back into the system. So in the case of Putin, in the case of Xi, you have a little bit of an aspect of culture of personality. You have a single party kind of dominating the environment, um, which kind of looks a bit like the old model, but with some changes. So there is a natural kind of aspect of this, which is there. The question, of course, is when you get that new punctuated equilibrium, does it grow and change, or does it kind of drift back and get pulled back towards the way in which things operated in the past? So this is kind of a number of the things that you potentially see, right? A lot of this is really related to shocks. You typically don't, you either find slow evolutionary change, So the nature, for example, of the culture of selfies, the culture of social media, um, all of that was very slow, very, I would say, methodical. But the irony of that, of course, is that while uh, there's a whole group of sort of kind of self-absorbed selfie takers, um, the the decision to put a camera on the front of the phone was actually kind of accidental. It was never core. Similarly, text messaging was never viewed as core to the initial development of mobile phones. Those things were simply added on as kind of little bits and pieces of sort of kind of cute stuff that people thought about, but nobody knew where it was that they were going to go. Now, phones are used almost rarely for talking to people. They're used for other things. And that was a slow evolutionary change where one thing built upon another. Other types of things are very radical. They're real structural shifts associated with, for example, the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Terrorist attacks have been existing for a long time, and in fact, they've declined over time. But that one event was material in creating radical change. The Arab Spring looked like it was going to be one of those, but it turned out not to be quite um, uh, what it was hoped to be. So you have all of these types of things which change societies. There are also aspects of cultural borrowing that come in, and this is very important in marketing because a lot of marketing for multinational companies is moving a cultural aspect of their product, the brand, the communication, the color, all of these types of things, and moving it from where they have it originally in their home market into another market. And then for more mature multinationals, moving it from one market to another market. So in this sense, there is a lot of cultural borrowing. Now today, this is a negative term, would be called cultural appropriation, but it's 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 natural. It occurs. Whether it's viewed as morally right or morally wrong is another question. Okay, but cultures subsume things all the time, and in fact, this is some of the strengths of you know a number of empires. So if we look at the Roman Empire was not really Roman. It was this amalgam where lots of stuff was borrowed and integrated into what ultimately would be considered to be kind of the Roman Empire. Again, the nature of what it is to be American. Again, that is all kind of big borrowed and stolen. Yes, there may be new kind of Americana which arose, but rock and roll. You look at music. How did music evolve? American music is very distinct. Well, a lot of it is related to gospel. Blues is related to gospel. Jazz is related to gospel. A lot of that grew up on Caribbean plantations, was then imported into the United States. All of this actually has an aspect. This then gets moved around, right? So rap music grows in inner city America. It all of a sudden finds residence in the United Kingdom, in Africa, in the Middle East. K-pop is another example. So a lot of Japanese culture. It all kind of has this kind of cultural borrowing that is in fact actually a real source of value. But the main point of this being that in some sense multinationals are doing this all the time in terms of the nature of the marketing and the products that they're selling, is they're moving things from one culture where they've been successful in that one culture, and they're moving it over into another cultural milieu. So in that sense, the idea that there is kind of an insular kind of home alone culture that is not begged, borrowed, stolen, merged with other cultures is simply misnomer. It is a big melting pot. It kind of melts and then it coalesces. It melts, it coalesces, melts, coalesces. And this is where I think kind of a key part of this kind of comes in, and it is that you have to really be careful when you talk about culture because similarities and differences could be an illusion. So what happens is people will look at things and they'll say, well, these this group is different from this group, or this group is similar to this group because they have a common language. Well, that's actually not true. The key question is there is going to always be difference. And one way to deal with this is to sort of say, well, every individual is a culture of one, and then you can build up from that. But then the question becomes, well, does it matter? Individuals may express themselves in very different ways, but they may fundamentally have the same beliefs and needs. In reality, once you strip away all the noise and stuff, right? This is where Maslow's hierarchy of needs come in, right? And there's certain fundamental things which are there. So there is this commonality, and this commonality. I mean, I could joke and sort of say, well, we're all descendants of space aliens because there's some show on the Discovery Channel that talks about aliens, not all the similarities we see amongst humans couldn't possibly occur, unless there were space aliens. The reality, though, is that those similarities may be very fundamental to species, uh, and it may simply arise due to the nature of the environment in which we find ourselves generally as a species on the planet, and to the nature of our biological makeup. So yeah, the languages are different and certain other types of things are different, but people still care about the children. People still care about future generations. People still care about protecting their properties. People still care about many of the same things. Um, but a lot of that maybe get hidden. And what this can cause us to do is to think that there are differences that are important when there are really only minor differences. And this really is related to the fact that you have very heterogeneous individuals making very heterogeneous decisions. And if most of what the individuals differences in their decisions are simply due to random taste, you can misassume, you can misattribute that the differences that you see in their behaviors is related to some other difference that you see in some measure. So you might say, oh, well, the Chinese are more collectivist than Americans, and therefore the reason that you see Chinese behaving different than Americans is because of this. The answer to that question is no. There's quite an interesting study that was done a number of years ago, which looked at uh, Chinese students and American students as an example, and it asked the question: could the Chinese students be made more individualistic, and could the American students be made more collectivist? The answer to the question is yes. And what they did is they simply made it financially more painful for people to behave the way they were kind of culturally associated with paying. In other words, they could price the collectivism out of the Chinese, and they could price the individualism out of the Americans. The question, of course, is then, well, what's the price? And there's another paper which is related to kind of more ethics, and it is the title of the paper is great. It's called "What Price Fairness?" And one of the questions was, can you price fairness out of individual interactions? Can you make people unfair? And the answer is yes. You just simply make it more costly to be fair, and people very quickly become unfair. So the point of all of this is don't assume that just because some difference exists that difference is fundamental. Um, to some extent, the more fundamental it is, the higher the price is to get it to change. Now, let me give you some examples of this. If I look at this type of information here, where I'm looking at donations in a country and donations to religious groups. Right. So on the right hand side, on the left hand side of the screen that's there, is a measure of belief in a higher authority. So belief in God, for lack of a better thing, right? And the question is, what happens to donations as individuals believe in God more? So do not believe is obviously the atheist, absolutely certain of the true believers. And one of the things that's interesting is if you look at this, the percent of donations that individuals give to religious groups rises dramatically based upon whether they believe in God. Okay. And this is independent of the countries. Okay. So if you look at that graph on the left hand side, basically what is if you saw that graph, you would not be able to guess the differences in those countries, really. And you might sort of say, well, okay, yeah, the US, if you truly believe in God, you give almost 60% of your total donations go to a church or a religiously affiliated donations. But how materially different is that than the 48% or so that you see in Australia or the United Kingdom, right? Or the 40% in Germany, where the churches are funded by the state, where there's a direct tax called the Kirchensteuer, where you tax people of religious groups to take taxes and put them into the church. The answer is that it's just order of magnitude. It's not really that materially different, okay? Which is telling you that there's consistency here. You look at that graph, you can see the consistency in the behavior. The difference, of course, shows up when you look at the U.S. Why is that difference? The percent of all donations to church or religious affiliated groups is so much higher in the U.S. And it's actually due to the fact that there are simply more people in the US who are in that fairly sure and absolutely certain um, category. In other words, there were fewer atheists in America than there are in the United Kingdom and Germany, let's say. But if you are heavily religious, doesn't matter which country you're from. So the way you interpret the information, the way you look at the information across these countries becomes very different. So if you were going to appeal to individuals based upon religion, okay, the only difference is that there are simply more people to appeal to in America than there are in Germany, but appealing to them may be very similar. Okay, so depending on how you look at that information, you can sort of say, well, there's a real similarity here, right? There's a similarity across the strength of the belief. Doesn't matter where you are, but the people who hold those strengths of beliefs are different across country. This is another example, one of my favorites actually. Again, the same basic belief in religion at the bottom. Um, but the other thing is the importance of that to politics. And if you look at this, you'll see, okay, here's Australia, there's the UK, there's the US, and there's Germany. Okay, and again, you see exactly the same type of pattern. Okay, in the case of the Germans, it's a little bit less extenuated. But the question here is again, it looks at this and sort of says, if you look at it the right way, what you see similarities where people would otherwise think there were differences. And one of the reasons I like this graph is because there during the 2016 election, and in fact in some elections prior, right? There's always this question about appeal to the religious right in the United States, and the newspapers would sometimes say, well, it's a bit crazy in the U.S. It's no crazier in the U.S. than it is some other place, except for the fact that there were simply more people in the U.S. with these strong religious beliefs. The issue is not what happens when you compare somebody with weak religious beliefs or no religious beliefs, with somebody with strong religious beliefs. The difference is how many are in those categories. And in the American case, there were more people in those categories, and therefore you would expect more politicians to play to that, because for the politicians, votes matter. So the number of votes matter. Okay, and if there were more, if there are fewer of those people in Germany, then you don't necessarily have to appeal to them. Right now, you can flip this over and sort of say, okay, well, how do we then look at this with respect to other types of things which are related to marketing? And the answer is, again, it depends on how you want to focus on it. Are you focusing on the differences, or are you focusing on the similarities? And these may appear in exactly the same pieces of information that you're getting. And now what I'll do is I'll show you a video during the real class. But you actually see that there's enormous amounts of cultural appropriation that goes on. And the question, of course, is when you start looking at this and you look at different types of examples, and all of these examples, by the way, are different companies in different countries using the Gangnam style from Seoul of dancing, where Gangnam style, of course, has its own connotation, which we can talk about. Okay, but being used in very different ways, um, but it shows a cultural similarity, a willingness to kind of engage with a K-pop type of, or a Korean uh, rap type of phenomenon, and then to utilize it across different cultures. Okay, so it's not an uncommon phenomenon, and in fact, is a very tried and true type of approach, depending on whether it's used for humor or whether it's used for seriousness or not. So let's go back to the elements of culture and talk about consumer behavior. Um, and in essence, we come back to this segmentation, targeting, and positioning notion. Okay, and that is that if you look at the underlying cultural values, um, these can have a materiality if they're utilized in the right sorts of ways. And again, because culture is such a big concept, such an amorphous concept, it opens itself up for an infinite number of points of discussion. We'll kind of keep this to a few, and that is that certain types of values link to certain types of viewpoints about what it is that you purchase or don't purchase. For example, luxury goods. So, if you use the Chinese example, there was a tremendous growth in luxury brands because they were signals of status. If you look at other cultures where they are not only signals of status, but they're actually sources of holding value. So if you look at countries, for example, where there's a lot of jewelry seen, some Middle Eastern countries, certainly in India, a lot of this actually has to relate it to holding value. In other words, people actually hold a lot of their wealth close to themselves. You have other environments in which that status doesn't reveal itself. So different cultures will have different kind of views of this. If you operate in let's say a more Calvinistic, historically, let's say a more Protestant environment, there would have been a kind of an anti-luxury. In other words, luxury would have to remain understated rather than overstated. And how individuals would signal their status would be done in a different way. Um, so in some cases, status is signaled by what people wear. Some people it's where they live. Some people it's whether they have kind of a grunge understatement associated with it, where they appear not to parade the wealth and other aspects of it. So the consumption of certain types of products and certain types of goods will be linked to this. The entire luxury watch market falls into this category. Handbag markets fall into this category. All of this is kind of examples of that. The nature of the way in which purchasing occurs. For example, the willingness to take on debt, is very different in very different countries. Also, the ease of taking on debt is very different in very different countries. The nature of impulsiveness is related to the time frame in which people engage in decision making. This may be related to age. Both of these may be related to age, and they may show up in the countries because they show up as being related to age, but the country has different age distributions. So as a country would age, its penchant for certain types of goods might change over others. Um, Word of mouth and communications relating to trust. Um, it's very interesting if you look at the data on recommendations. So do individuals follow recommendations, and where those recommendations come from? There's a notion in sociology, but and also political science about high trust versus low trust countries, or high trust versus low trust cultures, and that is that high trust cultures, America would be perceived to be a high trust culture, and high trust cultures are ones where there's verifiability of information. So most Western countries, countries like Japan as well, Korea, generally speaking, are viewed as high trust countries simply because there's an enforcement mechanism related to fraud. Countries like China, Vietnam, Russia, number of other Eastern European countries, Romania, Bulgaria, um, are low trust countries simply because the belief in the information that's there is lower. It turns out that if a company engages in fraud in the United States or in the United Kingdom, they potentially could run into trouble. Whereas in many countries, fraud's the norm, and therefore things like word of mouth communications matter more. And to some degree, this is one of the areas as to why influencer marketing works. Um, because influencers essentially grew organically. Nobody went out and created influencers. It was never, it was not created by the brands. It was not created by the multinationals. The influencers grew on their own. And when you looked at this and you sort of say, okay, well, where would influencers potentially have more value? Well, potentially they would have more value, at least in a trust sense, to the degree to which they have high credibility. And the question, of course, is, well, where do they get that credibility? And therefore, you would say, okay, well, if you don't trust what it is that you're seeing from the company of itself, if you don't trust this information coming from normal sources, you seek it out from other sources. Now, the question, of course, over time with the influencers is, have the influencers gone from a trusted external unbiased source to simply someone who has been bought? Um, and in that sense, there is the issue of the credibility of the influencer at some point. In other words, they have to be balanced off, and this is an issue that influencers really do have. In other words, to what degree do they remain independent of their sponsors? There's also differences across countries in propensity to complain, how they complain, um, whether they do so anonymously or they do so directly, um, you know, uh, to the degree to which they will use different types of enforcement mechanisms, and then also simply how style is interpreted in different countries, and the difference associated with it. So what is stylish in New York is not necessarily stylish in Tokyo or Beijing. Although, what might be stylish in Tokyo might be stylish in Beijing, but it might not be quite so stylish. Might be stylish in Australia, except amongst a small group of people. And then when you look at this, there's a difference between what's known as a priori versus a posteriori um, segmentation, targeting, position. A priori targeting and positioning is essentially where you would go out and you would cluster people into groups and you would sort of say, oh, these are the fashion mavens, these are the eco moms, these this group and this group. So you go out, you survey people, you look at it, and you create clusters of people. Um, that's actually been, generally speaking, become much less important. With the rise of big data, almost all major organizations go towards what is known as a posteriori or behavioral targeting and positioning. And that is that what companies do today is they look for patterns of behaviors. So they don't care so much about what you think. They don't care so much about your attitude. They care about your behaviors. And this matters a lot. It matters a lot in certain key areas, such as ethical consumption. If you go out and you survey people about the nature of what they would consider when they purchase a product, whether they would consider the environment or labor rights or whatever, people always say, "Oh yeah, I'd consider that stuff." But when you look at their market purchases, you invariably find they don't care. And therefore, you have to kind of look at the in context behavior of individuals. This has always been very hard to do, but in big data environments, it's actually a lot easier to do. So you can look at these patterns of behaviors, what things are purchased with what other things, under what context they're purchased, and you can see big differences in actual behaviors. And then what you can do, because you can see a lot of information about a single individual, you can look at that individual and you can build a model for that individual, and which means that generalized stereotypes such as the Chinese consumer go by the way. What matters is that Chinese consumer, and you can look at things in very detailed types of ways. What this means is it means that for firms, large multinational firms in particular, having lots of information about people, um, which they can get across cultures, across countries, across circumstances, allows them to be much more effective in terms of utilizing that information to engage in specific targeting. So there's a lot of issues related to sort of kind of the culture associated with resistance to change and unplanned change. Um, you know, different consumers in different cultures are more resistant. They also may exist in environments that are more existed resistant. Um, more conservative. We use a general term. Um, the Generally speaking, though, when you look at new products, innovations, things coming into the market, um, they have to have a resonance with the society. In other words, it has to be an easy slot in. Okay. The second aspect of this is that there has to be less disruption. In other words, if you require people to radically change their beliefs or radically change their behavior or radically change their current value structures to achieve an outcome, um, there will be technological resistance. There will be resistance to the innovation associated with things. So if you look at things like text messaging, I'm old enough to remember mobile phones when they were actually phones. Text messaging was not material. It existed, but it was not material. It probably took 15 years for text messaging to really catch on to the point where it became a much more critical component of what it was that was there. Simply because people weren't ready for it. And also there's an issue of kind of where there might be cultural conflict between the things that are uh, in the culture, which are potentially embedded in the culture. And this is seen, for example, in groups where there's an official religion, where there's actually a state religion in some regard, or there's a political orientation within the state, and therefore that leads to an immediate conflict associated with um, uh, foreignness, and the liability of foreignness in that case very hard. It is also the issue of kind of where change is coming in, and that is the companies increasingly plan change. In other words, they don't try necessarily to assume that the market of tomorrow is going to be the market of today, and therefore they work towards this much more so than they did years ago. Um, so companies would essentially not plan for product obsolescence. Today, companies plan for their products to be obsolete, um, and therefore, what they do is they work much more effectively towards not the current generation of products, but the next generation of products. The whole model of fast fashion, for example, was driven by this idea that tomorrow is not today, and therefore you can't kind of have longevity. You build into the system the obsolescence of the product, and this is why when you look at companies today, many of them view themselves as platform companies. They don't view them as products or even service companies. They're platform companies. In other words, they provide the platform by which the product gets to the consumer. And in that set of circumstances, they don't care what the product is. The product becomes less important than the means by which the product gets there. And that generates a kind of a viewpoint. The other aspect of this is that if people's attention spans become are very short, their loyalty becomes very fragile. Then what you have is a set of circumstances in which you always have to have Plan B, and therefore you end up in a world where you sort of say, well, if my product's going to be destroyed, I'm going to be the person who destroys my product, not my competitors. So I will destroy my own product to get my next product in play, as opposed to having them destroy it and having them get the next product in play. So if we look at culture generally, you can ask yourself the question, what tribe do I belong to? And the answer to that question is you belong to many tribes. And I give a lot of examples here, but the main point is you could look at yourself and you can ask yourself the question, all right, you know, where do I fit? And under what circumstances do I fit in that tribe? So we have this tendency to stereotype cultures, and I give purposeful examples of, for example, an Aborigine here, South American Indian here, space alien here, Buddhist here. Okay, um, but you can be again. Here's kind of Bavarians here, but you can say, well, no, hang on a second here. What about the biker community? What about the rocker community? What about fashion communities? What about my football teams? Right? What about the things I like in terms of popular culture? What about the my again, maybe fashion or lifestyle? Right? Am I college educated? Am I part of the AMBS culture? You know, on down the line, right? All of these things you can come up with hundreds of these, and this is where a big difference arises, right? The big difference arises in that you are an embodiment of many different cultures. So I look at myself and sort of say, okay, what am I? I'm Irish, an American, but I probably identify more as an Australian now, right? I've got German residents, British residents, Hong Kong residents, right? Well, I've got science degrees, I've got university degrees, work with companies, speak several languages, right? Play musical instruments, you know, keen cyclist. You just work your way across and sort of say, well, what tribes do I belong to? Depends on when. Under different circumstances, you draw different tribes. And then within each tribe, there may be kind of little sub tribes and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it not only occurs, across your life and between individuals, it occurs in kind of microcosm where you're a complex combination of all these things. which is one of the reasons why you might step away and sort of say, okay, well, when I look at how culture is measured, is it really measured right? Is it really capturing that? And you can see this in a number of different ways. This is indigenous languages spoken in the United States. I grew up in this area here in which there is a specific Pittsburgh accent. There's a specific culture attached to that. Okay. Um, we all would know things like New Orleans and Louisiana, very different. Right. In Florida, there's a phenomenon called Florida man, but even in Florida, there's many different types. And in New York, if you went into New York City, you'd find that there are all sorts of tribes, depending on where it is that where it is that you live. Right. So there are many different ways to do it. And in fact, in the United States, up until the beginning of the 19th century, there was a long discussion about whether German would be an official language, because the German heritage in the United States is huge. Again, you can see this in Germany. You can see the different dialects in Germany. I lived over here. Trier is over here. Trier had a very specific dialect, which was really unique to the region. And I knew I was in trouble. For example, one day when I was in Frankfurt and I was talking to somebody and I must have said something and they said, "Oh, you're from Trier," because they immediately picked up the accent. They picked up a word I was using, which was very different. China, another hodgepodge associated with this, and in particular, as you go into larger countries, you see this. You can see it in France. You can see it in Spain. You can see it in Italy. There are all of these variations which people hold on to in greater extents, right? And again, just to go into the Asia context, probably the most ethnically diverse area is this Indonesian archipelago, where you have enormous what is known as ethno-linguistic fragmentation. Okay, South Africa. We can go through many of these, and as you look at all of this, what you see an extraordinarily complicated way of sort of thinking about culture. Right, it'll come back again and again and again and again and again in terms of the nature of the things that we think about and what it is that we talk about. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop this video here at this point in time because this will be kind of the end of the kind of the formal culture lecture, and then I'm going to come back with an add-on to this where I'm going to just talk a little bit about some technical things, but just do that very short period of time, which some people may find useful and other people may not find useful, but it's there for as a resource if people want it. So that's the end of the culture lecture, and hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.